Okay, well, welcome to Hebrew Story Hour. And we are going to be reading Genesis 22 today. I'm excited about this. I'm anticipating some good conversation. All right, so Genesis 22. May the Lord bless the reading of his word. Vayehi achar hadvarim ha'ele. Baha Elohim nisa et Avraham. Vayomer elav Avraham. Vayomer hineni. Vayomer kach na et bincha et yechidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak. Velech lecha el eretz Hamoriah. V'ha'alehu sham le'olah al achad heharim asher omar elecha. Vayashkem Avraham baboker vayachavosh et chamoro vayikach et shnei na'arav ito ve'et Yitzchak beno vayevaka et atse olah vayakom vayelech el hamakom asher amar lo ha'elohim. I'm going to stop there. So I didn't announce verse numbers, but we read through verse 3. So going back to translate. And it happened after these things that God tested Avraham. And he said to him, Avraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go, or maybe get yourself to the land of Moriah and offer him up there as a whole burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will say to you. In verse 3, and Avraham got up early in the morning, and he saddled his donkey, and he took 2 of his young servants with him, and Isaac his son. And he split wood of the burnt offering, and he got up and he went to the place where God had told him about. Okay, verse 4. Vayom hashalishi vayisa Avraham et einav vayar et hamakom merachok. In verse 5. Vayomer Avraham el na'arav shuvu lachem ho im ha-chamor va'ani ha-na'ar ne'lecha ad ko v'nishtachve v'nashuva aleichem. Verse 6. Vayikach Avraham et atse ha'olah Vayasim al Yitzchak beno. Vayikach vayado et ha'esh ve'et hama'achelet. Vayelechu shenehem yaktav. Pausing there, going back to verse 4. On the 3rd day, Avraham lifted his eyes and he saw the place from afar. And Avraham said to his young men, sit here, basically, sit yourselves here with the donkey. And I and the young boy, the lad, let us go up, let us go unto there, and let us worship, and then let us return to you. In verse 6, and Avraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and he placed it upon Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife, And they went, the two of them, together. Verse 7. Vayomer Yitzchak el ha'Avraham, Aviv, Vayomer Avi, Vayomer Hineni beni, Vayomer Hine ha'ish, v'ha'etzim, v'aye haseh le'olah. Vayomer Avraham, Elohim yireh lo haseh le'olah beni, v'yelechu shenehem yaktav. Verse 9. Vayavo'u el hamakom asher amar lo ha'Elohim, vayivin sham Avraham et hamizbeach, vaya'aroch et ha'etzim, vaya'akod et Yitzchak beno, vayasim oto al hamizbeach mima'al la'etzim. Translating in verse 7, Isaac said to Abraham, his father, and he said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God will see to it." Traditionally translated, "God will provide." We'll come back to this. God, we'll go with that for now. God will provide it, the sheep, for a burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went together. And they entered the place about which God had spoken to him. And Abraham built there the altar. And he bound Isaac. He laid out the wood, and he bound Isaac, his son. And he placed him upon the altar above the wood. Verse 10. Vayishlach Avraham et yado, vayikach et ha'ma'achelet, lishchot et beno. Vayikra elav malach Adonai min hashamayim, vayomer Avraham, Avraham, vayomer hineni, vayomer al tishlach yadecha el hana'ar, va'al ta'as lo me'umah, ki ata yadati, ki yirei Elohim ata, v'lo chasachta et bincha, et yechidcha memeni. Vayasa Avraham et einav, vayar v'hine ya'al, achar ne'echaz basavach b'karnav vayelech. Avraham vayakach et ha'ayel, Va'alehu le'olah tachat beno. Vayikra Avraham shem hamakom hahu Adonai yireh, asher yeamer hayom, Bahar Adonai yireh. Okay, pausing there, going back to verse 10. And Abraham sent forth his hand, and he took the knife to slaughter his son. And an angel of the Lord called to him from the heavens. And he said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not send forth your hand toward the boy. Do not do anything to him. For now I have known that you are a fearer of God, and you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted his eyes, and he looked, and behold, a ram We might want to amend this, but I'll go with the MT behind him, maybe grasped in or caught in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and he took the ram and he offered it up as a burnt offering, a whole burnt offering, instead of his son. And verse 14, and Abraham called the name of that place Adonai Yireh, which as said even, or which as it is called today, or as it is said today on the mountain, Yahweh, it's Yerah, so it's really Yahweh appears, or Yahweh will appear. It's actually on the mountain of Yahweh, he will appear. Okay, I kind of want to stop and talk about it, but I think we're going to read a little more. We're just going to read this whole chapter today, and then we'll go back and talk. Okay, so verse 15. Malach Adonai el Avraham, Shenit min hashamayim, vayomer bi nishbati ne'um Adonai, ki ya'an asher asita et hadavar hazeh, v'lo chasakta et bincha et yechidecha, ki varech avarechecha, v'harba arbe et zaracha, kechochavei hashamayim, v'chachol asher al sefat hayam, v'yirash zaracha et sha'ar oivav. Verse 18. V'hit barachu v'zaracha kol goyei haaretz, ekev asher shamata b'koli, v'yashov Abraham el na'arav, v'yakumu v'yelechu yachdav el ba'er shava, v'yeshiv Abraham b'er shava. Okay, translating. Verse 15, and the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from the heavens. And he said, by myself, declares the Lord, I have sworn that because you have done this thing, you have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will bless you, and I will multiply your seed like the stars of the heavens, like the sand which is upon the shore of the sea. And your seed will inherit the gate of his enemy. Verse 18. And all the nations of the earth will bless themselves by your seed, because you have listened to my voice. And Abraham returned to his young men, and they got up and they went together to Beersheba, so Beersheba, and Abraham dwelled there in Beersheba. All right, now I'm going to read the last part, even though it's kind of its own thing. Vayehi acharei hadvarim ha'ele, vayugad la'Avraham lemor. Hine yalada milka gam hi banim, lenachor achicha. Et utz bechoro ve'et buz achiv. Ve'et Kemuel avi Aram. Verse 22, lots of names here. Ve'et Kesed, ve'et Chazo, ve'et Pildash, ve'et Yid Laf. Ve'et Betuel. Uvetuel Yalad et Rivka. Shimona Ele Yalada Milka Lenachor Achi Abraham. verse 24. Ufalag sho ushama ru'uma bateled gam hi et tevach ve'et gacham ve'et tachash ve'et ma'acha. Okay, let's translate this. Going back to verse 20. After these things, it was told to Abraham, saying, look, Milcah has borne sons, even she, to Nachor, your brother. Uts, his firstborn, and Buz, his brother, and Kemuel, the father of Aram, and Kesed, and Chazo, and Pildash, and Yidlath, and Betuel. And Betuel fathered Rivkah. These 8 Milcah bore for Nachor, the brother of Abraham. And his concubines, this is verse 24, and his concubine, and now her name was Ru'umah. She bore also Tevach and Gacham and Tachash and Ma'acha. Okay, so we have a genealogy at the end of this. Okay, that's chapter 22. Maybe more to talk about at the beginning and with this story than at the end, but let me throw it open to any comments or questions that you all have. Marisa.
In verse 5, using the term Hana'ar,
yeah,
for both the servants and for Isaac, seemed unusual to me because it almost put Isaac and the servants on the same level. And every place else in the story, Isaac has his own name, except it seems in this, he either has his name or it's son.
Yeah. And Bin Ben is used a lot in this story for Isaac. Yeah, when Abraham is speaking, he speaks of him, at least in, I think that's true throughout the story. Maybe is this the only time where Abraham actually speaks of Isaac and calls him the Na'ar, and I and the boy?
It's the only place I noticed.
Yeah, God regularly refers to him as his son and really emphasizing your only son whom you love. But Abraham himself doesn't protest in this story, right? And that's part of why it makes it difficult, or recognize him as his son. That's a good observation. It's interesting, like we think back at with the Isaac Ishmael stories and some of the language that was used, that Abraham talks about Ishmael as his ben. I mean, he might do that with Isaac as well in the previous stories, but sort of like Abraham was troubled because about sending Hagar and Ishmael away because it was his son. Yeah.
I wonder if he just calls him the boy instead of my son to sort of emotionally distance himself from what he's about to have to do.
Yeah, he seems really distant. But I mean, in some ways, Na'ar is a fairly nondescript word, sort of just, but there may be something to that. Daniel.
He does address Isaac and uses Beni in verse 8. I don't know if we mentioned that.
Nope, that's what we were looking for.
So that's direct discourse to Isaac rather than direct discourse to the other Na'ar.
Yeah, good. And so that's when he is, when he's talking to him. But that seems, and I think this narrative, this is the kind of thing we ought to pay attention to. So like, it's really not necessary. It's this vocative, my son, but yeah, that's a good point.
I've heard some consider that perhaps it's not vocative. Right. That perhaps it's a positive. That makes for an interesting kind of interpretation.
Yeah, there's this ambiguity, right? So everybody looking at verse 8, where he's Abraham said, God will, we can talk about this, Yireh lo, will see to it the sheep for a burnt offering, my son, sort of making, basically saying that my son is the sheep, right? My son is the whole burnt offering. So there's taking it as a noun in apposition rather than as a vocative addressed to Isaac, where he's sort of, there's this kind of maybe purposeful ambiguity where I think it's at least a vocative is a reasonable understanding, but then that there's potentially this other meaning, at least we might imagine in Abraham's mind, that Beni is also the Seth.
Yeah, that's I agree that, it's, I think on one hand it's clearly this vocative, but I think we're invited into this willful kind of ambiguity to consider what's running through Abraham's mind, that God is going to see his son, my son, as the offering. And it's very poignant when we kind of allow for that creative ambiguity on the part of the narrator.
Yeah, for sure. That's good. Thank you for bringing that up. It's on another hand.
How, for the I think you translated it boy, does that really carry the connotation of being young, or is it looser?
Yeah, it's a pretty broad category. Even in Genesis, we've been seeing this term for a child, but it's also kind of has this over, like these are his servants. These are the guys who serve him. But it doesn't always mean servant. So it doesn't necessarily, I've always thought of Na'ar as sort of an adolescent, but it doesn't necessarily refer to, it's hard to put these in categories. Like it's not necessarily distinct from Ish, a man or something, but it's usually associated with servitude or a younger age.
But I guess my what I'm getting at is Isaac's age. Is it consistent with him being in his late 30s, or is it,
with Isaac being in his late 30s?
Yes, when the term is used to refer to him.
I would say no, not necessarily. I'm trying to remember where we would get the idea that Isaac would be in his late 30s here.
I thought that when the numbers are added up, I'd have to go back and look. But this is a...
Yeah, that could be like sort of trying to figure out. And of course, adding numbers can work out sometimes and not in other times. But yeah, I think Na'ar would more, the previous story, one of the difficulties with this story and is how closely to read it with some of these other stories. But the previous story, he seems to be a pretty young child. This one just has after these things, right? Okay. So it's connected back to the previous story, but doesn't give us any kind of real time reference. Maybe maybe somebody else sees something though that might be missing.
It seems like there's a wide range in BDB of what it can mean. Anywhere from an infant, just born, to a boy not weaned, a boy just weaned, a young boy, or a man of marriageable age, as well as a personal servant. That's just all over the place.
It's pretty broad. In some ways, we never gonna. Often we won't have perfect English terms for Hebrew terms, but a young man sort of works. But you're right. I mean, like, even in Genesis, we've seen it used for a baby or a child, which boy sort of works well for that, or na'ara could be a girl, just sort of really broad, generic type of terms. But maybe boy and man, or girl and woman, those kind of distinctions might be made between like na'ar and ish and na'ara and isha. But I wouldn't want to hold too fast to that. I guess we need to look at a lot of verses and see how they're used and see if you can get to this kind of concept behind it. Go ahead, Daniel.
I just will point out Rodney Cloud, who taught at Lipscomb for a long time and went to Hebrew Union. I believe he wrote his dissertation on the term na'ar. Oh. And I've never read it, although he referenced it many times in class. And he was often point out that sometimes it seems to mean something like an up and coming sheik. In other words, particularly in Samuel in regard to David. But I think one thing that's demonstrated across the usages is dependency. That it's not a person who is out yet on their own with a family. That in some sense they're often dependent, and I wonder if that's really the idea. Like even if they're dependent in a sense of they serve as individuals, like a warlord or something like that, they're still kind of in a dependent relationship within whatever social structure they're found. And that's just a thought.
Yeah, that does get at a broader. I love that. I'm not surprised. There's dissertations on all sorts of things, but it's actually a good project because there's so many usages of na'ar, and it does make sense. Like you wouldn't call Avraham a na'ar.
Yeah.
I mean, he's connected, family. He has all these familiar relationships. He has wives and children and all these things. But perhaps somebody who's not attached yet. It's good. So it may not have so much to do with age, but sort of connectedness.
Yeah, I think. Yeah.
That's good. Other comments or questions, Logan?
Yeah, before we get too far into the narrative, I have something on verse 3. I wrote a paper on this chapter before I knew any Hebrew. And so I was interested to come back and look at this because I remember reading something about how this verse, like the number of verbs and the order of what Abraham does in verse 3 seem to indicate, at least one author said, some hesitation or some just distress that he's in leading up to the moment of going and getting up early in the morning and then loading up the donkey and then getting the people and then going back and cutting firewood. So I just wonder if you see that there in that verse, or if others, any thoughts on like hesitation. I know that like the psychoanalysis of this passage, there's a lot that's been written about it, but I thought that was one interesting thing to note early on in the story, potentially.
Yeah, so whether verse 3 sort of demonstrates that he's delaying in some way?
Yes, yeah, just delaying or distress because some of the things seem to happen out of order with what you'd expect, or are hurried or choppy,
right,
in some way.
I could answer that. Let's throw that out there. What do you all think about that? It's a good question. I mean, part of the root of this question is we want Avraham. We can't imagine Avraham not suffering with this decision, right? But it's not obvious that he does. But maybe are there clues that we see him struggling, or is the story trying to say something different, that he's just that obedient or something?
I have a hard time thinking that he would in any way not struggle, because whenever you think about, particularly in this day and age, the idea of having a son is very important. Mm-hmm. And as a guy who, I'm unable to have children, and thinking about the idea that if I was finally given a child and then told, you got to go sacrifice him. There is no way possible that I would just be like, sure, what time, let's go. There's no way. I can't imagine the circumstance where a normal or even close to normal human being would possibly, without any hesitation, just go and do it. I could see that somebody just reading the story of Abraham as well, considering his past indiscretions, maybe, I don't think he's just some perfectly robotic, obedient character, because problems, which makes him much more relatable. And to that end, I think whenever we follow through with this story, he does what he's supposed to do, but I don't get the idea in any way that he's in a hurry about it. It says he gets up early in the morning, and my guess would be it's because he's like, I wasn't asleep anyway, so let's just go, right? And I don't know.
Yeah.
That's the way that I would take it, but that doesn't have anything to do with what the Hebrew reads as. That's just kind of a human sort of a perception.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, and I think that does hit home. That's why this story is such a struggle. This phrase of he got her up early in the morning often precedes sacrifice. I always think of Job, like the prologue of Job after his children party, and so on. And he wants to make sure he covers any kind of secret sin. He gets up early in the morning to offer whole burnt offerings on their behalf. And we've seen Abraham in obedience after hearing from God, getting up early in the morning. And so I think that is the first signal of sort of like quick action. I mean, this follows upon, there's no dialogue, true dialogue. It's just hearing from God, which I will show you, or which I will say to you. And then he gets up and he does everything to prepare for the sacrifice. Abraham gets up early in the morning. He binds his donkey. He takes a couple of his servants with him and Isaac, his son, and he splits the wood of the whole burnt offering. He gets up, he goes. There's a lot of action. And usually that string of vayiktols does infer sort of obedience. I think I don't think the narrative seems uninterested in showing us Abraham who struggles with this. I can't imagine doing this. And I want to talk more about that, but it seems like to me the narrative is showing that he is just kind of doing as he's told without protest. Go ahead. The hand up, and then Marisa.
Is when you translated it, bind the donkey, is that the same word for binding Isaac later, or is it different?
No. Yeah, good question. It's a different word.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. This is so saddled. The donkey might be a little bit better in this context, but just to make the different distinction. Marisa?
It seems like, to me anyway, you could almost take verse 3 in opposite directions.
Mm-hmm.
You could say, okay, we have all these verbs, and so they're showing that Abraham is a man of action. Or it could be, it's like, okay, I have to do this, and I have to do this, and I have to do this.
Yeah.
And so it's like he's got this long list. And sometimes when there's something really important you need to do, you think of all the little pieces to it, and each one just keeps making the task seem larger or greater. And so it seems to me anyway, you could almost read it as a man of action or a man who's slowly working through all the details of something he doesn't want to do.
Yeah, it's the slowly part of it that I think it does see. I mean, he gets busy, finds something to do, and then they walk for 3 days and so on. And I think, yes, we sort of naturally get into thinking through Abraham, but think about Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? God tells Abraham in chapter 18 and then 19 that he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham protests. And he persuades God. He said, what if there's 50 innocent people there? Would you destroy? Surely, and they have this dialogue about God's justice and this protest, and he works him down to 10 people, and there's none of that here, right? And there's been this drama over Isaac's birth in the first place, or them having a child, and sort of this face crisis, or this, even the laughter that associated with it. And then there's really none of that sort of emotion or drama in this story. Just to problematize this, recently there's an argument that's been made by a scholar, Richard Middleton, and I just became aware of this yesterday. So I haven't read his book, but I watched a video presentation of a paper that he gave on it. And he argues that, if I was more familiar with the argument, I might be able to support it better. Whenever you're trying to tell other people about what a scholar thinks and you don't agree with him, then I just want to say, I may not give the best representation of his argument, but in general, he would say Abraham fails a test here. That what God was testing in Abraham was whether his love for his son would overcome the fear that he would feel toward God. So what God was saying, would Abraham fear me so much that he wouldn't love his son? And he does support this in some ways with particular texts. He looks to chapter 18, he looks to chapter 19. He's reading this in continuity, trying to make sense of this. And what God wanted him to do was to protest, to talk back. He has a chapter on Job, and I pay attention to that one, but it's where, when Job, after God speaks the first time, he's just silent, which is not what God wants. He wants to converse. And so God continues to talk until Job has a kind of a larger confession or response. So what he wants from Abraham is to demonstrate his love for his son by protesting against God. And so in statements like, now I know that you're a fearer of God, Middleton would hear that in a way of, well, now I know you're a fearer of God. I think it's problematic because of the blessing that seems to come on account of the fear of God. But it's a rather elaborate argument. And it seems to me to be a clearing of God's name. It's kind of pious reading of this, because I can't imagine God, it goes against the fabric of who God is to require child sacrifice. Right? Which is, of course, he doesn't in the end. He stops him from child sacrifice and those types of things, but it's just putting the onus on Abraham maybe more than God. God is just, and he's been trying to teach Abraham his justice through all these stories. His reading of the persuasion about Sodom and Gomorrah is like, well, he should have asked for more than 10 people. God would have relented. If he would have just, why did he stop at 10? He's trying to teach him, would you just be merciful? And it's, yeah. God wants to show justice. God wants to show mercy. So anyway, I don't think it's probably going to win the day, but it's an argument that is not totally new either. You kind of go back, and this story has such a history of interpretation as Christians and Jews both wrestle with it. I have a little more on some of this, but I'll open up to y'all. Daniel?
Yeah. That I would remember that as in Jewish discussion, that view comes up very often, that Abraham ultimately failed the test. But regardless of that particular interpretation, surely it seems the text is in a sense a vindication the character of God against child sacrifice. It's a text that has the connotation that ultimately God doesn't want child sacrifice, and it's this, you know, a strange way of emphasizing that point. I've had the opportunity over the last couple of years to talk to many different people about this passage because of a project that I was working on. And one of the scholars that I was able to talk to pointed out, and he's a Catholic scholar, but he pointed out that the first verse is very important with the use of the word nasa, and that God actually doesn't test people very often in Scripture. It's really rare. As he said, it's tiny. You know, the amount of times that God actually, we can think of Job and we can think of David, but you really struggle to find this. And his point was that for many Christians, you see them almost framing their lives as if the whole thing is a test from God. God is always testing us. But that the text is not very explicit with this idea of God testing us. And so it's this should really jump out to us in the first verse of this chapter, that this is a test and this is not something that's typical or usual. So I just wanted to interject what was shared with me. And I thought that was a really important idea. And I've spent some time thinking about how I could relate that to audiences, and would welcome other ideas on what might be important.
Yeah, that is helpful, because it's true that we sort of think, well, I'm just trying to pass the test. That in the end, but most of life is not about God testing. That's good. And it's another important statement. Just thing to note about that is, you as a reader, this is true for every testing story. You know up front that this is a test. As a reader, as an outsider, even though Abraham doesn't know that. He doesn't hear, because that would subvert the test itself. But it probably sets the tone for what you're about to read, right? Everything after this, now it sets a frame for what kind of narrative this is. Same thing happens with Job. So at the prologue, you know all this stuff about what's going on that Job never knows, even to the end. Dustin?
I was thinking about, I'm trying to remember exactly where it is, but Jesus would say, if you don't hate your father, mother, and even your own life, and all these family relationships, and even your own self, then you cannot be my disciple. And of course, the idea there is not like I need to actively hate and be disrespectful to and mean to my own family members. But I think the idea is similar to what Abraham was being asked, that if his love and respect of God is enough to override his devotion to his earthly connections. And as you said, of course, God doesn't actually follow through with, or allow Abraham to follow through with the sacrifice of his son, but it is a test to see, previously, I would argue Abraham had failed tests along the journey to get here. Mm-hmm. And he seems to be growing in his faith and growing in his maturity and so forth as he goes along, which I think is valuable. Yeah. But I don't know. I think that there's something to be said for that idea.
Certainly it's about, just looking at the narrative, right? God says, your only son, the one you love, sort of really playing out, making it obvious that I know this is somebody you value. And that's an understatement, right? And asking sort of it's kind of the ultimate, to give whatever it would take, which, the other thing is this is that it's not just taking, a child, it's taking the whole promise that God has given to him. So like do you trust me in the ultimate way?
Well, isn't the Hebrew writer that says that he reckoned that he would receive him back from the dead, right? In a sense, like, even if I do kill him, God would raise him back. And then he goes on to say, in a sense, he did, because Abraham already knew what he was going there to do, and then he didn't have to. Yeah.
So that's one of the areas that's fascinating with this story, because it has such a history of interpretation, Jewish and Christian, but especially early Christian interpretations, I think, this may be true for Jewish too, but the secondary interpretation, right, would be that Abraham knew that God would preserve his promise, so that he expected him to come back from the dead. I always, there's a couple of things that track, maybe not with resurrection, but with Abraham's faith. The line that always stands up to me is when he's giving instructions to his Na'arav, right, to his young men. And he says, you know, we have all these cohortatives. This is verse 5. I and the boy will go unto there, and we'll worship, and we will return to you. And, you know, you can read that as simply just kind of pacifying these guys so that they don't, you know, I'm not going to tell you exactly what's going on. But it does seem, I think it could also be read as sort of the statement of faith. I'm coming back with him. And to me, that seems there's a lot of potential in that little phrase there. Scott?
That idea of resurrection, is that something that we know historically was also a Jewish idea, or is that only something that we see in Christian origins, like the writer of Hebrews and later?
I don't feel confident in saying about early Jewish interpretations. So I'm not sure if it's there. You have a Hebrews. I remember this. I wish I remember it better for this moment, but I had to interpret or translate a Syriac story, a reading of this, where you get into the ram caught by the horns being sort of a Christological figure, right? So there's a Christological reading of this. I don't think that story talks about resurrection. Abraham expected resurrection. But I do think that I think the early Jewish readings, and maybe it's you all are searching for it right now and finding it, but have some notion of kind of Abraham's faith that God would stop him, or would intercede, or would resurrect. But I would have to look at that. There was a comment made here. Kevin made a good comment. Yeah, Dead Sea Scrolls.
Probably not as well developed as early Christian doctrines on the resurrection, but their early Christian doctrines do grow out of early Jewish hope for resurrection.
Yeah, certainly. Oh, yeah. If we're talking about like general resurrection, kind of expectations for bodily resurrection, definitely there's kind of this move in the intertestamental period. Whether that was associated with as like a reception of this story or not, I'm not sure about, but definitely Dead Sea Scrolls, Daniel, these kind of later, even biblical texts lay the groundwork for bodily resurrection. The other, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask that. I was looking at the time and I was like, I wanted to get to the idea that you said, on the mountain of the Lord, Adonai, Yahweh will appear, as opposed to the traditional Jehovah Jireh, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, that sort of has had my ear since several weeks ago. He's not here, but Adrian, one of the guys that had been on, he said something about that, and I've been just sort of stewing on it since then. So I was like, I want to talk about that.
I'm glad you brought it up. So I think that's verse 14. So you actually have it's the word yara, or ra'ah rather, the verb ra'ah, and then vayar. It happens several times, right? So Abraham lifts his eyes and sees the place, and a lot of this story does revolve around the mountain, the place, right? The holy site that they're going to, Moriah, as it's called once. But he lifts his eyes, he sees it, and then Abraham's response to Isaac's question is, I've got verse 14 in mind, but it's Yahweh will see to it, or yireh, so it's the imperfect verb. That's usually provided, because I mean, what God does is provide a ram, right? So in context, that's the way we get that. Then verse 14, Abraham called the name of the place, or that place, Yahweh Yireh. Jireh is just you all know now. It's a bad pronunciation of Yireh. And Jehovah is a misunderstanding of the divine name. But, people are still expressing faith when they're saying that. But I do think there's something, I like to press this idea of God seeing. Then you'll notice in the last part of verse 14, it's in the Nifal, Yahweh Yera'eh, which is appears. The name on that mountain, Yahweh appears. I like that better because I think it's it's a little bit more ambiguous, leaving a little more open what it means for Yahweh to see. But you remember back, like in the Hagar story, it's a little different. El Roi, the God of my seeing, or maybe the God who sees me, where Hagar is seen. So there's something about God drawing near, even as you're seeing the place, Abraham seeing the place, God intervenes. And when God sees, he steps in. There is some textual evidence for, I think it's minimal, so I wouldn't stake anything on it, but that the last one should be not the Nifal, but the imperfect Yahweh sees, Yireh. You just change up a few vowels, which instead of Yahweh appearing, or the name of the mountain, well, in the place of the mountain, Yahweh appears, or in the place of the mountain, Yahweh sees. So I like to push back a little bit against simply just Yahweh provides. I think there's something more here than just provision, but Yahweh actually interceding through his sight, paying attention.
There's one other it just hit me. One of my favorite, I don't know exactly how to phrase it, but one of my favorite passages that I remember from the Exodus is at the very end of chapter 2, whenever the people are crying out for deliverance because the burden has become so oppressive. It says that God saw the people of Israel and God knew. And I think it's interesting that he says he saw them and he knew. There's a man comes to Jesus because his disciples couldn't drive out the demon. He says, would you look at my son? And it's this idea, just if you see it, you can't look at it and not intervene, kind of a thing, is almost the way that I see that. But with this, there's this active participation idea that I get with God will see to it, as opposed to,
right.
there just happens to be a ram here. It's provided for you. It's like, no, I'm going to make sure that this gets done.
Right. And
I think that's very different than he provided it. The things are here provided for you, as opposed to I'm going to see to it.
Right.
And whenever I think of the idea that God does offer his only son, the similar idea, he will see to it. I'm going to make sure, and in fact, in the Transfiguration account, they're talking together with Moses and Elijah about his exodus that he is going to accomplish at Jerusalem. It's not this passive idea. It's like, I'm going to get this done. I have to see to it. Yeah. And that to me is a very more active participation in what's going on than it's provided. And I think that has a lot to do with why it really caught my attention whenever I was like, that's not what we normally hear.
Yeah, that's good.
Anyway, I get excited. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, it's getting excited. I see a hand. I'm Dan. I'm guessing not Dan, but.
This is Betty. Dan has a meeting
already,
7 in the morning in Washington State. I think that it's unfortunate that there's a chapter break in this story between the one about Ishmael and being kicked out. Ishmael is not a small child. You know, he's for his mother to be able to put him under a bush, it was not because he was not strong. It was because he was suffering deep psychological grief that his father, who loved him, had just set him out because of a woman. Okay, a woman's statement. And you see, Isaac now being considered the cock of the walk, that Ishmael, taking Ishmael's place. By having this potential sacrifice, it restores a sense of balance between the two brothers. If you look at when Isaac thinks of God after this, it's called the fear of Isaac. He's called the fear of Isaac.
Yeah.
See? And you don't see Abraham returning back to Sarah. You see him going to Beersheba after this. When Sarah dies, Abraham is in Beersheba. If you look at Hagar, is the name of runaway. It's not, it may not have been her original name, but the name Keturah, beautiful, what beautiful, I would have to think about that. Dan's the one that knows the Hebrew the best. If you think about Keturah being blessed, Abraham has these sons, several of them. You know, he's already 99, you know, when he has Isaac. And so there's a time when Joseph is taken to Egypt that it talks about the Ishmaelites came through, and then it also talks about the Midianites. And many people think that when they say that together, that Keturah is really the one that was Hagar. See, and so that the sacrifice that God did not mean to be a true sacrifice was a balancing act for the two brothers, because they did join together. Now, they didn't care for the ways of Sarah, and I think that when God says to Abraham, do whatever she says to do, he was hoping, he was probably spending the night trying to talk her out of her harsh feelings. But it would not have worked for Isaac to be there and Ishmael, because she would have been hostile to that young man.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's where we're coming from.
There's a lot there. Thank you,
There
Betty.
is a lot there.
I do think it's important potentially for this story with the kind of the fear of Isaac phrase. That I think that bringing that up, and also just kind of the past. One, maybe my last comment, I know we're need to end here, is that, you know, a lot of these stories do invite us into explore. And that's one of the things, the beauty of what we get to do here. Sometimes, you know, we explore in an area, maybe the story doesn't necessarily lend, but I do think like reading these stories together is really fruitful. So that's good. You know, that this is also Isaac's story. You know, Christian history tends to take this to be God and Abraham's story, but actually Jewish history tends to be to interpret this as God and Abraham and Isaac's story, which is certainly worth considering the nature of his character and what this leads to in his own life, and the stories that will come in future weeks for Hebrew Story Hour. Okay, well, thank you all for your attention. We will meet next week, and then we'll probably take a couple of weeks off before the new year. I use the Hebrew Story Hour Facebook page for announcements. So if you're not on there, if you're not on Facebook, good for you. But if you are, you can join that page and get updates.
Okay.
Well, Shalom Lachem. Thank you, everybody.